Welcome to Preparing for the Transition from LIBOR to SOFR, presented by FEI Twin Cities Chapter. Thank you for joining us today. Before we get started, we would like to share some information regarding CPE credits with you, and we appreciate your patience. Today's webinar is worth 1 continuing professional education credit. To be eligible for CPE credit, you must answer at least 3 of the 4 polling questions within the slides during the webinar and have a total viewing time of at least 50 minutes. Participants will have the opportunity to download their CPE certificate immediately following the webinar if the above requirements are met. In accordance with the standards for the National Registry of CPE Sponsors, CPE credit will be granted based on a 50-minute hour. We are unable to grant CPE credit in cases where technical difficulties disqualify eligibility. CPE program sponsorship guidelines prohibit us from issuing credit to those not verified by the technology to have satisfied the minimum requirements listed above. I encourage you to download today's presentation, which is located in the Resources widget on the lower right-hand side of the screen. After the presentation, this webinar will be available on the FEI member site where you can replay and download. After the conclusion of the webinar, your CPE certificate will be available in the Certification widget and will also be emailed within 24 hours should you meet the criteria. Below the speaker biography widget is the Q&A box. Please feel free to ask questions throughout the presentation, and the speaker will answer as many questions as possible. It's now FEI's pleasure to introduce Mary Lou Lamberton. Mary Lou?
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Roseanne, and all of the FEI team for your efforts in hosting our discussion today. On behalf of Wells Fargo, thank you to all of our attendees, many of you whom we work with and some we are excited to meet for the first time. As one of the largest lenders in the nation, we are very close to this topic, a critical and timely transition, which is moving from LIBOR to SOFR. In fact, Wells Fargo was chosen in part to lead our discussion today because we are a key member of the ARRC leadership team. ARRC stands for Alternative Reference Rates Committee. This is the industry group convened by the Federal Reserve to transition from US dollar LIBOR. Wells Fargo is deploying extensive resources to support this transition for our customers and the marketplace. Our efforts, as you will learn today, are to guide our customers not just through the process, but to educate and provide answers as well. Every one of us needs a map. For today's discussion on this ongoing process, I'm pleased to introduce Colleen McCord and Readie Callahan. Colleen, thank you for your effort on our Q&A today. Colleen is an integral part of the Wells Fargo LIBOR transition team, joining the bank in January as part of this effort. And Readie, who will present our information today on all elements of the transition to date, is the head of communication strategy for the Wells Fargo LIBOR Transition Office. This office is charged with developing and directing the execution of a coordinated strategy to transition the numerous LIBOR-based products and processes across Wells Fargo to alternative reference rates. Readie represents Wells Fargo on several industry working groups, including the ARRC, which I referenced just a moment ago. What's unique and helpful about our team and for our team and the customers as you as engaged listeners today is that Readie joined Wells Fargo Securities in 2011 as an investment banker, and therefore she represents not only the process, but serving the needs of clients and understanding their concerns and creating solutions. Her leadership role on the LIBOR team, starting in 2018, she offers more than the process and project management. Importantly, she offers business insight and customer perception. We will begin today with a survey. So Michelle, please give our audience our first polling.
What are your current thoughts regarding LIBOR transition? Please be sure to make your selections and press submit. Don't forget to send any questions you have throughout the presentation through the Q&A box, as we'll have some time to go over them. I'm going to give you about 10 more seconds left to make your selections and move to the results. Readie, here are our results.
Great, thank you. So I think this is really helpful to get a baseline understanding of where our audience is with respect to LIBOR transition. So what I see here is about 64% have little to no knowledge on this topic. So I may get into a little bit more about the background. 28% consider themselves well-informed, and 7% have expert knowledge. So I applaud everyone with their expertise here. So what I'd like to do is really have a conversation. Feel free to ask questions as I'm talking to memorialize your questions at the time. And what I'd like to do is provide some background, give a snapshot of the US market today, and then we'll get into your questions at the end. So to begin with, just to level the stage, LIBOR transition is really a huge endeavor. It's estimated to be about $400 trillion of products worldwide are impacted. And so that could be anything from a large billion-dollar corporate revolving credit facility to a swap or even an adjustable rate home mortgage. The US market has more of a retail exposure. Some of our credit cards, our student loans, and again, the ARM industry that I referenced are impacted, as well as your everyday loans and derivatives. I'm going to focus my remarks on the US market, but there are 5 primary currencies in LIBOR, and each currency jurisdiction is conducting a similar process to what we're doing in the United States, where it's identifying a replacement rate and identifying a transition path forward. But before I get into that, what I think is helpful to recognize is out of the many different currency jurisdictions, the US dollar LIBOR is about half of the total exposure. So there's a really significant aspect of the US transition. It is the lion's share of exposure. So why are we transitioning? What happened? So LIBOR at its core, and 30 years ago when the rate really became more pronounced and more common in a lot of our contracts, is that it represented the rate at which banks could borrow from each other. It's been known as the interbank lending market. And it was a robust market. That's how banks used to fund themselves. But fast forward to today, and even the last decade, we've seen a significant decline in those interbank lending trades. And so the effect that that has is you have these panel banks, these 11 to 16 panel banks, who 30 years ago would submit the rates at which they actually borrowed from each other. But right now, since there aren't any transactions that underpin that interbank lending market, they're effectively submitting rates based on expert judgment. What happened during the financial crisis, and many of you may recall, back in 2008, 2009, is that there were allegations of manipulation. So what effectively happened is you had some bad actors who were artificially adjusting LIBOR either high or low to effectively adjust their books at day end, right? It was all about P&L. As I'm sure you can appreciate, the regulators have a big issue with 1 or 2 bad actors being able to manipulate a $400 trillion market. There were billions of dollars in fines, and the regulators sought to fix LIBOR. So first, they reinforced the governance and the methodology behind LIBOR. How can we fix this structural issue? They spent many months fixing and solving for LIBOR, but at its core, they weren't able to solve for the fact that this interbank lending market no longer exists. So in 2017, the regulator of LIBOR, which is in the UK, so the Financial Conduct Authority, announced that it would effectively be able to deem LIBOR non-representative. They forecasted that because LIBOR can't be fixed, it's not based on real transactions, that the market should generally migrate away from LIBOR. At the same time, you had panel banks, and I think we can all understand why, sitting back and saying, okay, there aren't real trades for me to base my rate on, and 2, why would I subject myself from further allegations of manipulation? So panel banks had started talking about withdrawing from the process. So the UK Financial Conduct Authority said, hold on, we can't wake up tomorrow and have no LIBOR. So let's start mapping out an effective transition. So first, Andrew Bailey of the FCA brought all of the panel banks to the table and said, let's come to an arrangement. And they concluded that panel banks would continue to submit LIBOR through the end of 2021. But after 2021, the FCA would not compel them to do so. So when we talk about LIBOR transition, there isn't necessarily a specific date that's carved in stone. The way we refer to it is after 2021, there's no guarantee that anyone will submit LIBOR quotes. So effectively, the regulators have guided us as a market that we need to be transitioned before the end of 2021. There have been some news articles lately that suggest we might get clarity around that quote unquote end date towards the end of this year, but it's not a guarantee. That said, we're progressing forward to find alternatives and migrate the US market and the other jurisdictions away from LIBOR. In the US market, Mary Lou referenced the Alternative Reference Rates Committee. There are a lot of acronyms here, but we refer to it as the ARC. And the ARC was convened by the New York Fed, and it's comprised of about 50 different entities. Wells Fargo is a member, as well as other banks, insurance companies, trade associations. It's really designed to represent the broader US market. I want to say about 1/3 are banks and the rest are non-financial institutions. The design there, particularly with the trades, is to ensure that the broader market has representation. So you might have LSTA for loan syndications or SFA for securitizations, where it's one entity at the table. However, their membership comprises multiple hundreds, if not thousands, of entities. So that's the backdrop for who is part of the decision-making body, or at least the entity that is making recommendations to the market. It's not just those 50 entities. There are dozens of working groups that are focused on specific aspects of the transition. And what they're doing is focusing on, again, subject matter expertise. So while the ARC has 50 members, the broader working group body comprises, I think it's up to, over 200 different entities. So again, this isn't one person making a decision. This is a broad representation of the market. So in 2017, the ARC identified its replacement rate. It evaluated over several years multiple options. And you can see on the slide in front of you, to me, this is the single best illustration of why the ARC recommended the secured overnight financing rate, which is also known as SOFR. And effectively, we have to remember the issue with LIBOR, and you can see it third from the right, and it barely makes the screen. It's estimated that 3-month LIBOR, which is the most robust tenor of LIBOR, if you're lucky, you might see 500 million in average daily trades. Now, we saw earlier this year, it's estimated that there were probably closer to 0 trades during the market dislocation. And so as, again, a $400 trillion market, that's a cause for concern. So when the ARC was evaluating the rate to select in lieu of US dollar LIBOR, it did. It evaluated T-bills, effective Fed funds, the overnight bank funding rate. And what it found is they really wanted a more robust rate, a deeper market, because we're going to see changes in any rate throughout history. If the market has a dislocation, we want the rate that we select to still continue to be robust. So that's where SOFR came around. And as you can see from this chart, this one actually shows 850, I think, billion in average daily trades. In fact, over the past year, it's exceeded 1 trillion in average daily trades. And the reason for that is SOFR is effectively the US Treasury repo market. So it's an overnight market in which entities post US Treasuries as collateral and borrow cash. So it's a fully collateralized borrowing market. It is the deepest, most liquid borrowing market we have in the US. So the ARC identified that subset of the repo market and focused specifically on secured trades. And the idea being that when you have a flight to quality, you'll see people continue to transact in something that is fully secured, particularly fully secured with treasuries. And as you can see here on this chart, it is by far the deepest market in terms of average daily volume. However, that is a very different rate from LIBOR. As you can see on this chart, and I'm sure you're aware of, so LIBOR is what we call an unsecured rate. It's based on an uncollateralized rate. So that right there, SOFR being secured, LIBOR being unsecured, is a very fundamental difference. LIBOR, you have multiple tenors. Many of you probably borrow in 1 month LIBOR, maybe you borrow in 3 month LIBOR, but there are 7 different tenors of LIBOR and they're all forward looking. So you borrow on day 1 and you know your rate for that term. Right now, we only have SOFR available in an overnight rate. Now, the ARC and the broader market would like to have a forward-looking term rate similar to what we have with LIBOR. The challenge is that in order to derive such a forward-looking term rate and still be compliant with some of the international reforms that were made after the financial crisis, the key is that it has to be based in objective and transparent transactions. So in order to derive a term rate, we need enough activity in overnight SOFR lending. And we're not quite there yet, but the ARC forecasts that we will have a term SOFR available around this time next year. But currently it's only available in overnight. LIBOR, inherent in that secured, unsecured aspect, has a bank credit premium. SOFR does not. LIBOR is a subjective methodology. While its waterfall prioritizes real transactions in the interbank lending market, the reality is that market doesn't really exist today. SOFR, by contrast, is an objective volume-weighted median of specific types of U.S. Treasury repos. It's through Bank of New York Mellon, DTC. It's very objective and transparent. It's administered by the Federal Bank of New York. All of the data, including the volume and the rates, are available on the New York Fed's website. And LIBOR is administered by a private company, ICE Benchmark Administration. And lastly, back to the volumes. I would call 500 million in average daily trades for LIBOR probably a generous characterization, but SOFR by contrast exceeds 1 trillion in average daily trades. As we can think through the differences, the qualitative differences, there is a quantitative aspect. So this chart shows a time period of SOFR versus LIBOR. And what you can see is there are 3 different lines. So let me explain what they are. Your red line is your 1 month LIBOR. And then the light blue line is daily SOFR. So every day we have a new rate for SOFR. But the expectation is that similar to current loan conventions where you pay on a monthly basis or you pay on a quarterly basis, it's expected that we will also use SOFR on an average basis. So for example, instead of getting an interest accrual invoice where you have 30 rates for a 30-day period, what you'll likely see is an average of the prior 30 days. So that's what the darker blue line does, is it shows you, it illustrates an average, a 30-day average of SOFR. And why that's important. We expect that the SOFR market, and we've already seen it in certain products, is going to use an average, which smooths out some of the volatility. Some of the critique of using SOFR as a benchmark rate for the loan market has been that inherent in the repo market, there is some volatility, specifically at quarter end and year end. And you can see on the chart, right about September of last year, there was a really significant spike in the repo market. And that was a result of some dislocations in the repo market. You had a lot of settlements in treasuries, you had a new auction, you had tax time, and effectively you didn't have the right match in supply and demand. You have a lot of reserves that are set aside for capital purposes, and a lot of entities weren't able to deploy capital. So repo rates, just broad repo rates, spiked to 10% on an overnight basis, which is pretty wild. Now, that was only a couple-day period, and SOFR spiked to 5.25, but it definitely made some people step back and say, well, is this rate really appropriate for the broader loan market? What I can tell you is the Fed has stepped in and provided liquidity and continued to provide liquidity through this year. But that, 5.25 spike only translates into about what is it? I think it was 3 basis points over a 90-day period. And the comparison is that LIBOR actually increased by 4 basis points over that same period of time. So while it may look shocking, in effect, its effect is pretty de minimis because, again, when you're averaging rates, averages do what they're designed to do, and they smooth out that volatility. Another thing about this chart, this illustrates SOFR from 2014 to current. Well, SOFR was first published in 2018, so you might ask, well, how do we have rates before SOFR was actually published? And the answer is that because it's a data set that has been available to the market and to the Fed for a long time, what the Fed did is they pulled the same data set from, again, Bank of New York Mellon, DTC, and they backdated what SOFR would have been had they begun publishing the rate in 2014. The Fed further published some backdated information going back all the way to 1998, and that is available on their website. Now, I'd like to focus a little bit on what happened this year, because we also saw a big divergence between LIBOR and SOFR. That was different than the spike we saw in September. So earlier this year, as COVID really reared and increased its exposure in the United States, we saw the market react. And what you can see here very clearly is that as the Fed cut rates, we saw Fed funds decrease, we saw SOFR decrease, and we saw LIBOR increase. And in fact, the difference between 3-month LIBOR and SOFR well exceeded 1% for quite a period of time. Now, what's interesting is there are many different interpretations of what this means. So as a borrower, I think that the preference would be for something that moves with the Fed rates, right? You would want something that is lower rather than something that spikes during a market dislocation. The regulators saw this chart, and we've heard from the FCA, we've heard from the Fed, that they view this as an illustration that further supports the move away from LIBOR. They see this as LIBOR just did what it did. There's really no basis for why it did. Some can argue it was a flight to quality, and that's why we saw SOFR declining. But the reality is LIBOR moved in a way that was inconsistent with the rest of the market, fundamentally because it's an unsecured rate. No one's going to borrow and lend on an unsecured basis without a premium attached to it. And so that's what we saw here. So effectively, since the global crisis, while those rates have come back together, this spike, this divergence to many of the kind of the regulatory institutions or authorities, they view this as further support of the transition away from LIBOR. And what's interesting to note as well, there have been many questions that given the severity of COVID, does this actually delay the LIBOR transition? And what's interesting is some of the large regulatory bodies, there's one called the FSB, Financial Stability Board, which is essentially a supranational regulatory body. So, the Fed is a participant, the Bank of England is. You have either central banks or regulatory bodies that are part of the FSB. And they reprioritized for 2020 based on COVID. And they kept LIBOR transition as one of 6 items that they felt were most important for the global market to focus on. So the $400 trillion question of is LIBOR transition delayed? The answer is no. The regulators have made it very clear that despite the turmoil and the challenges that we're faced with related to COVID, the transition is progressing and still has a target date of end 2021. Now, SOFR was a rate that was first published in 2018. LIBOR, by contrast, has had well over 30 years to become the $400 trillion market. So what we're asking SOFR to do is to ramp up to that $200 trillion level in quite a small period of time. That said, we have seen a significant pickup in activity. We've seen about 20 trillion in notional issued to SOFR. So those are your floating rate notes. Those are your derivatives, your futures. And in the derivatives market, options began trading earlier this year. This probably isn't the level that we need in order to derive a forward-looking term SOFR, but this activity continues to increase. And there are several milestones that are coming up this year in which we think it will really be the trigger to kind of launch more activity in SOFR. I'll get into that a little bit later. So Michelle, next polling question, over to you.
Select the option that best describes you. Please be sure to make your selections and press submit to ensure that your answers are recorded for CPE credits. Your selections will be made within the slide deck, and don't forget to submit any questions through the Q&A box. I'm going to give you about 10 seconds left to make your responses, and we'll move to the results. And here are our results.
Great. So the results are about 24% feel that your company is well prepared to manage this transition. 48% have said we're not quite there yet. And 28% have viewed us as none of the above. So maybe perhaps you haven't begun or it's not relevant for you. So this next slide actually will be helpful for those who have not yet begun. I'm not going to cover all of these aspects. I would encourage you to read it and or check out the New York Fed's ARC website about this. But part of the challenge in this transition is getting everyone educated and getting everyone prepared for the transition. So the ARC released a checklist to identify specific areas to help each firm transition and prepare for no LIBOR. And the ones I'd call out are essentially identifying an individual or a group that can run point on LIBOR transition, stay apprised of the information that's coming in. One of the frustrations, which I can appreciate, is that we don't have all of the information. We're still trying to figure it out as a market, so we don't have all the answers now. There is a lot of information that comes through. Having someone in your organization be aware, be on point to share anything relevant is good practice. And then the other thing that I think is most important is really assessing your contracts and your LIBOR exposure. What contracts do you have that are tied to LIBOR? And are those contracts robust enough to survive a LIBOR cessation? And what do I mean by that? I'll get into it in just a moment, but do they have good fallback language? And if not, are there changes that you should be making? Is it just your LIBOR contracts? Do you have a LIBOR swap? Is LIBOR a default rate in one of your contracts? And does that need to be amended? So it's really doing the due diligence to explore where your LIBOR exposure is. Many of you, it may just be in your contracts, but if you're a large institution like Wells Fargo, for example, it's in everything from systems, models. It pretty much affects every part of our company. Now, I don't expect that to be the same for many of you, but just understand where your exposure lies and be prepared to address what happens upon these changes. Do you have any accounting or reporting issues or anything that gets triggered if you change your rate? Those are the types of things that you should do your due diligence on and get an understanding of where you are situated with respect to the end of 2021 target date. Michelle, I think we have another polling question.
What topics would you like to learn more about? Please be sure to make your selections and press submit. I'm going to give you about 10 seconds left to respond, and we'll move to the results.
And part of this is that, as I mentioned, there are many different components of LIBOR transition, and there's a lot of education that needs to happen. Primarily, the reason is because SOFR is a brand new rate, so we need to understand as a market what it is, how it behaves, how that may impact a loan based on SOFR, for example. So different aspects of this, whether it's swaps, whether it's an international multi-currency facility, those are areas that really we can dig in and help you understand the impacts.
And here are our results.
I don't see the results quite yet, but once they come up, again, this will help guide us for future conversations, and I can certainly address some of the questions here. Oh, I need to refresh my screen, so let me do that. .38% are interested in swaps, which makes sense. A lot of the exposures are very much tied to loans. Many people try hedge their exposure. We have 10% that is interested in international rates, almost 30% in market dynamics, and 25% in operational readiness. And can help you with your broader operational readiness. And this is fallback language. So what is fallback language? Fallback language is the part of your contract in which it explains what happens when LIBOR is unavailable. If you look, it's typically in your LIBOR definition, but and again, excuse me, some technical issues here. So when you look at your LIBOR definition, for example, oftentimes you'll have some provision that says if LIBOR is unavailable, you do this. Now, the do this differs by contract. And originally, a lot of the legacy contracts, there was never the idea that LIBOR would be permanently unavailable. It was always the idea that if LIBOR was for some reason unavailable on a temporary basis, that it would go to this other rate, and then when LIBOR became available, it would come back. So oftentimes you'll see kind of the range. I like to bring up floating rate notes because it's a really good illustration of unintended consequences. But in floating rate notes, oftentimes you'll see, we'll just use last published LIBOR if it's not available. Well, if you use last published LIBOR and it goes away permanently, you now have a fixed rate asset. Derivatives, for example, uses a quotation process. So if LIBOR is unavailable, your counterparty or your calculation agent will call up banks in London, ask what LIBOR would have been. If they don't answer, they'll call up banks in New York and ask what LIBOR would have been. The broad expectation is that no one will provide a bid for LIBOR when it's no longer available. So that brings me to fallback language. So ISDA for derivatives, and for scope, derivatives comprise about 95% of the total exposure for LIBOR. ISDA has been working diligently to finalize their fallback language, which would replace the language in the master ISDA definitions. The ARC has published fallback language for multiple products. They released those last year. And essentially what they do is they focus on three components. Your trigger event, so define the circumstances under which references to LIBOR should be replaced. Be very clear about what those triggers are. Second is replacement language and the replacement rate. Identify what the rate will go to. And lastly, the spread adjustment. Is there a spread adjustment that is required to be made? Which, again, the goal of fallback language is to get you back to where you started. So derivatives and loans don't necessarily match up exactly. And for those who have hedges, it's very important to consider alignment of product. So we expect ISDA to release their final definitions pretty much any day now. It could be by the end of this month, or it could be beginning of August. And what we expect their language to say is that upon a public announcement that LIBOR will cease to exist, so that public announcement will be either by the administrator of LIBOR or the regulator of LIBOR, so the FCA or ICE benchmark. If they issue a public announcement that LIBOR is to be permanently ended, that would be a trigger event. Or if the Financial Conduct Authority, the regulator of LIBOR, they have the powers to deem LIBOR unrepresentative. If they do that, that's considered to be a trigger. Now, what does it mean to be unrepresentative? This really is around the idea that, after 2021, if we have, let's say, 2 panel banks that are submitting LIBOR technically will exist, but is it something that we should base our trades on? And the FCA has essentially suggested that no, it's very likely that they will just say LIBOR is unrepresentative and no one should use it. So that's what that pre-cessation trigger is. It means LIBOR is still technically around, but it may not really be worth using. And then the third trigger, which only exists in loans in the US market, is this concept of an early opt-in election. You'll see this frequently in syndicated loans. And the idea being that if and when the SOFR loan market is more robust, someone who has a LIBOR contract can just opt in to a SOFR rate well in advance of a LIBOR transition or a LIBOR cessation. Now, notably, that is not the case in derivatives, and it's only the case for loans. So right there you have some differentiation. And then in terms of the actual rate that's used, this is where we see the biggest divergence between the loan or the cash market, so your loans, your bonds, and your derivatives market. ISDA has been very clear that a rate, let's just use 1-month LIBOR as an example. 1-month LIBOR upon a trigger will go to a 1-month compounded SOFR in arrears plus a spread. That spread will be based on a 5-year look back, and it'll be the median between 1-month compounded SOFR and 1-month LIBOR. Right now, that's about 10 basis points. So you would go effectively from 1-month LIBOR to 1-month compounded SOFR plus 10. That would be the replacement from the LIBOR component. Now, again, those are rough numbers. The calculation for the spread will not be made until a trigger occurs. Bloomberg will be publishing those spreads. And again, that will be a very transparent process to the market. Now, the ARC on the loan side, loans prefer their term structure. They really like it. So they've opted to use a waterfall approach. So they will do, upon a trigger, the first step in the waterfall is typically a term SOFR. If term is available, then you would have kind of more similar, you'd have a forward-looking term rate based on SOFR instead of LIBOR. Now, if term is not available, you would go to the second step in the waterfall, which would be a compounded SOFR. So that would align more with derivatives. And then each product has their next step, so it does differ by product, syndicated loans versus a bilateral loan versus a floating rate note. So I would encourage you to pull the actual language off of the ARC's website. But this is a summary where effectively you have a waterfall approach. That's called your hardwired language. So it's hardwiring a rate into the documents. Upon a trigger, there's really nothing you have to do. It's already in the documents. The second approach is an amendment approach. And we have seen this kind of used in the beginning. We're seeing a switch as the ARC is really encouraging the market to use a hardwired approach. And what we're seeing, and so what the amendment approach does, it says, if LIBOR goes away, we'll effectively come back to the table and recommend a rate replacement. It will likely be what the ARC recommends, but it does require the parties to come back to the table. So I think understandably so, when we don't have all of the information at hand, people have liked this idea of having control down the road. However, when we look at the market, we have hundreds of thousands of contracts. And if they all use the amendment approach, I would suggest that it might not even be operationally feasible to re-amend all of them down the road. So that's where the ARC has come out and said we really strongly encourage the use of hardwired language, because at least it prescribes the rate. And oftentimes, you know, on the loan side, you can come back to your bank pretty much any time to explore other pricing. So the expectation is that when SOFR loans are available, you know, maybe that's what you do. Fallback language is designed to be a security belt. It's a seat belt. It's there in case you need it. But the expectation is that once the SOFR loan market becomes more robust, we'll probably see people just exiting their LIBOR loans and going straight into a SOFR loan. Now, the difference being with derivatives, it's not quite as easy to terminate a swap and go into a new rate. There could be some cost implications. And so that's why for derivatives, this fallback language is very important. The expectation is that a protocol will be conducted, so entities can just sign up and opt in, and it will, by definition, adhere them to these new definitions for rate triggers. And then, again, this is kind of a more detailed expectation of some of the industry timelines for, you know, through the end of 2022. Or end of 2021. What I'd like to point out is that a lot of this discussion on fallback language and some of the other areas is really the result of the loan market not being ready today, right? We have not seen bilateral SOFR loans broadly issued, nor syndicated loans. And the loan market has a huge impact on the liquidity of SOFR itself. I think come the end of this year, we'll see much more activity in SOFR loans, which again will provide relief and will de-risk the market away from LIBOR. So you'll see that in some of the expectations, right? We expect SOFR floating rate note issuances to continue picking up. We expect to see some bilateral loans issued in SOFR at the end of this year, beginning of next year. And along with the ARC's recommendations, we're going to start seeing no more new LIBOR products being issued. And then lastly, I'd like to touch on, before we get into our last poll and Q&A, this is really a snapshot of the global reform efforts. I mentioned that LIBOR exists in 5 primary currencies. Here you can see the results. Each currency has its own rate. So in the US, our working group is the ARC, and we've identified SOFR as the replacement rate. For example, in the UK market, they've identified SONIA as their replacement rate. Now, different from SOFR, SONIA has been published since 1997. So it has a much longer history. Market participants have a greater understanding of the rate. So we've seen SONIA pick up quite significantly. Last I heard, it's about 50% sterling LIBOR versus SONIA in derivatives issuances, which is a really good fact pattern. Slowly, it will be more SONIA than LIBOR, for example. So each currency jurisdiction has their own approach, which is different, right? We're disaggregating all of the LIBOR methodologies and bringing it back to each currency jurisdiction. So with that, Michelle, let's go into our last poll.
Great. We'll select the response that best describes your level of knowledge after viewing this webinar. Please be sure to make your selections and press submit. And don't forget to send any last-minute questions to the Q&A, as we'll be moving there shortly. I'm going to give you about 10 more seconds left to respond, and we'll move to the results. And here are our results.
Great, thank you. So it looks like 82% feel more informed, so I'll say thank you for that. I'm glad this was effective. 11% were already quite familiar with the topic, and 6% feel it was too technical. So that's great feedback for us, so thank you for that. And with that, let's jump right into Q&A. Colleen?
Great. Thanks, Readie. Yeah, we've got a few good ones coming in, and let's start with this one. When is the right time to start discussions on replacing LIBOR as an interest rate factor in credit agreements?
That's a great question. I would say yesterday would be a perfect time to start doing that. The reality is we've known as a market for a long time that LIBOR is going to cease to exist. Some people, it's like the spectrum of grief. Some people are still in denial that it's going to exist. I'm certainly, by factor of being in Wells Fargo's LIBOR Transition Office, I'm already at acceptance. But some people are in anger mode, or somewhere along the spectrum. But what I would say to you is that while we don't have all the answers now, it doesn't mean you can't ask questions to your bankers, and you should be informed about what your options are. I've seen some clients where they're very uncomfortable with the idea of uncertainty, and so they've opted to, go with a prime loan, for example. Now, that's not going to work for everyone, and it's certainly not the recommended approach for the entire market, but you have to do what makes sense for you. And I have some clients who are completely comfortable using fallback language and say, just let me know when I know my rate. So it really depends on your level of comfort, but these are conversations that you absolutely should be having with your banker. And we, have already incorporated more robust or ARC endorsed fallback language into our loans. So again, I think that's a conversation that I would encourage you to have now.
Great. And we have another good one. Does the shift to SOFR mean that the Fed will be administering the benchmark? And how do you anticipate that impacting the validity of this rate at the global level?
That's interesting. So yes, the Fed is planning to continue administering the rate. And to me, I think that lends much greater credence versus a private entity. No one is going to, or I certainly hope, no one is going to think the Fed is going to engage in any manipulation. And so they're very clear about their methodology. They're very transparent about what the rate is comprised, or how the rate is comprised. So I think that strengthens the support of SOFR worldwide. And what we've seen in each currency jurisdiction is that it is, in fact, their central banks or some of their primary regulators who are serving as administrator of the rates. And I think that is 100% a result of the manipulation that happened with a private company. If you bring it into the public domain, that's an area that you can protect and prevent manipulation.
Great. And there's another question here, and you may have already touched on this a little bit, but here it is. Is there a place where we can see the historical variance between the LIBOR rate and the SOFR rate? I would love to understand if it's been higher, lower, or not relevant.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So again, the New York Fed has published rates back to 2014, and then I want to say 1998 to 2014 is it's survey data. So they surveyed the repo market participants and the large dealers, but certainly 2014 to current, I think it is very valid data. It's effectively what SOFR would have been anyway, had SOFR been averaged at the time. And you can compare that to LIBOR. You can compare it to 1 month LIBOR, you can compare it to 3 month LIBOR, and there are differences. So on average, I want to say, I'm trying to remember what my averages are. I think my 5-year average right now is about 10 basis points for 1 month LIBOR versus SOFR. It's about 25, 26 basis points for 3 month LIBOR. So every tenor of LIBOR is going to have a different corresponding spread. But yeah, so historically SOFR has been on average lower. But you will see some periods of time like we saw in September where SOFR spiked above LIBOR. You'll also see that sometimes in the quarterly adjustments. It's been referred to as window dressing, but sometimes you'll see entities settle some of their lending right before reporting time. And that's why we see some supply and demand divergence around quarter end. That's kind of that window dressing. Those are the periods of time that come to mind in which SOFR was actually higher than LIBOR, but on average, LIBOR has been higher than SOFR.
Great. And I'll remind everyone, if you do want to submit any more questions, we're starting to run a little bit low. Readie, you spent quite a bit of time talking about derivatives in the contracts. And this question is about futures and options based on LIBOR. And the question is, what will happen to the derivative contracts, futures and options based on LIBOR? And just wanted to put that in front of you in case there's anything else you wanted to cover on that topic.
Sure, and it's a really good question. So broadly speaking, I think both ISDA and the ARC have tried to solve for the majority in recognition that there are parts and aspects of the market that will need different solutions. So what do I mean by that? The lion's share of derivatives will be able to use fallback language. So that's where I described, let's say it's a, vanilla fixed pair swap where you're paying fixed, receiving LIBOR. It's that LIBOR receipt that upon adherence to the protocol, that would change to SOFR plus a spread. Now, in the options market, it's not as simple, right? You have, depending on your option, you have different strike prices. And so that is a component of the derivatives market that is still under discussion as to how best to amend those types of trades. So there isn't a great answer on that, except to say that it is now, once we address kind of the majority, those are the pockets that are up next in terms of determining what the right approach is. And likewise, we see that in the cash market side, where the majority of contracts can be amended or adjusted to incorporate fallback language. Some can't, whether that's because it's a floating rate note and it requires 100% bondholder consent. Same thing with the securitization, or maybe there's something like, in the muni market, for example, where it would be required to go back for legislative approval. I mean, depending, the underlying reason. There are parts of the cash market where, again, there needs to be a decision made or a process to amend those that are not easily amended.
Great. And this is actually the last question. And you may have already touched on this as well. Is there any new clarity on how the adjustment to the spread on revolving credit agreements will be determined?
Yeah, so this goes back to what's actually in your contracts. So I can talk about what the ARC language would do, but ultimately it's going to be entirely dependent on what your contracts say. So if your contract uses the amendment approach, it might say it's up to the lender. It might say it's up to the lender and borrower as well. Oftentimes in the amendment approach, for example, they may look to whatever the ARC has recommended. So that's where the details do matter. But broadly speaking, if your contract uses ARC endorsed hardwired language, upon a trigger, that's where it would go through the waterfall. Step one, term SOFR if it's available plus that adjustment spread. Step two, if term SOFR is not available, would be that average of SOFR plus a spread. So again, it will be highly dependent on what your contract language actually says. And that's why it's really important to do an assessment of your exposure and what your fallback language actually is. And the spread, one more thing, just to, I know this point is raised quite often. Why is there a spread adjustment? And the reason for that is the goal of these contracts through fallback language is to get you back to where you started. Now, the challenge is LIBOR and SOFR, it's apples and oranges. So how do you get both sides of the equation to match? And that's where this median adjustment spread comes in. It's designed to get you back. There's no guarantee it will be perfect. But certainly it's better than just having your contract go to litigation because it's unclear what the rate will be. So that's really the design behind fallback language. It's a safety belt. it's good to have in your contracts. And I would strongly encourage you to evaluate your contracts that you have currently. The regulators, the Fed, the ARC have very strongly encouraged the market to adopt these types of contractual language. So I think you'll see a big shift in that. We've already seen a lot of clients incorporate this type of language into their contracts. It's just good best practice in terms of de-risking away from LIBOR.
Great. And Readie, that was the end of the Q&A.
Okay, great. Michelle, back to you. Thank you, everyone, for attending, and I hope this was helpful.
Thanks so much. This marks the end of our webinar. Thank you for joining us today. We look forward to you joining us on future webinars. You can find information about upcoming webinars in the resources widget. Don't forget to download your CPE certificate in the certification widget. Your CPE certificate will also be available to download in the thank you for attending email that will be sent within the next 24 hours. If you have any questions regarding CPE credits, please feel free to email conf@financialexecutives.org. Have a wonderful day, and again, thank you to our speaker for today's webinar.